All right, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Liam McCullum Show. I had a podcast fall through. One of my guests got sick, so I rescheduled with him, and I figured that I would just do a solo episode and record something pretty quick. We'll see how long it goes. But yeah, after my last podcast with Dan Sanchez, I've been trying to write a lot more. I started writing, I believe, on Monday every day, and I hope to continue that. We'll see how that goes. So I've released something every single day since that podcast, or since Monday, and I recommend everyone go check out that podcast with Dan Sanchez. He's the I forget what his specific position is. I think he's the editor in chief of the Foundation for Economic Education, and he was somewhat of my mentor while I was in their fellowship, their Hazlitt Fellowship, and we talked about the importance of writing and how writing helps you master ideas, and that's just one of the things we talked about. But the overall theme um, is along the lines of like how to collect yourself and how to speak properly and how to write properly and the importance of ideas and how if you collect yourself you can be the better representation of the ideas that you want the world to adopt. So it kind of is the Jordan Peterson principle of like, cleaning your house before you judge the world. And I figured, I haven't written as frequently as I'd like to, especially since I'm out of school now. And I also haven't returned to a lot of like the source material that first got me interested in liberty and the ideas of freedom. I haven't returned to them in a very long time. So I have been writing on Substack about some of the things that first got me interested in these ideas. And um, hopefully, as I've written in one of my Substack articles, I plan to continue to have a podcast every week. And then, if I don't have any ideas for what to write about, I'll just return to that podcast and write about that podcast. At the very least, just so it helps me retain what I'm talking with people about. So yeah, I would definitely recommend everyone go listen to that podcast with Dan Sanchez. I'll link to that in the description below after the stream is done. But yeah, and if anyone comes into the comments, please let me know how the audio is. This isn't in my usual recording environment. So if anyone stops in and listens live, just let me know in the comments. But yeah, so it is now 2 days since Election Day. I'm recording on November 10th for the people who are listening to this later. And yeah, they're still counting in Arizona, it looks like. It looks like Masters is behind quite a bit. Kerry Lake might be pulling ahead. And yeah, there wasn't as big of a red wave as people suspected. And there's a lot of analyzing of the electorate right now and why it wasn't as big of a red wave. And one of the bigger narratives that's coming out is that Trump was defeated and most of his endorsements were pretty weak. And I think that's probably right. There's also accusations of a lot of manipulation going on, and I haven't looked into that myself, but I know some people who are very interested in that stuff, and maybe I'll bring them on to talk about it later and make the case for that. But I mean, it is quite clear that at the very least, people in Arizona, people in Gallatin County here, people in Missoula County can't count at the very least. So yeah, there's a lot of narrative building right now, and for the people who are saying that that Trump and all of his endorsements looked weak and DeSantis looked strong. A lot of this, I think, is people trying to speak certain narratives and speak certain agendas into existence. I think a lot of this is speculation as to what actually voters were thinking about. And when anyone says that, DeSantis is the leadership of the GOP now, I think again that is just narrative building. They want their narrative to come out on top. And really, when you control the narrative, I think there is something about that and the effect that that takes on uh, the electorate's position. As I talked about with Benjamin Oblo about the Russia and Ukraine war, control of the narrative is very important, and I think that the reason we saw people flip so quickly, like especially the Daily Wire people, they immediately started saying that this was a repudiation of Trump, um, and that we need strong leadership in the GOP. And like I think that what that is a competition for the narrative to see um, if speaking that narrative into existence can potentially determine that future. Uh, and determine what voters are thinking about. So, at the very least, we do know that the GOP will have to go through some soul searching, and I've been saying that since it appears that the GOP is very weak right now and fractured, if they want to win libertarian and conservative votes over and strengthen their base, um, instead of deciding DeSantis, Trump, or Liz Cheney, I think that the clear option should be Rand Paul and Thomas Massey. Um, the Daily Wire folks are saying that uh, Trump looked very weak on election day, and DeSantis looked very strong, and strong candidates outperformed. And when I look at strong candidates, at the strong candidates who won, I also see that Rand Paul and Thomas Massey did very well and soundly defeated their opponents. So though DeSantis was very strong as a governor in Florida, I think an even stronger case is Rand Paul and Thomas Massey, especially since they have experience at the federal level. And I mean, they've been consistently right on COVID, spending, and Ukraine, which are all top issues right now. Whereas DeSantis, all we really praise him for is what he's done as governor. And I hope instead of running in 2024, he stays governor. I think he terms out in 2026. So I hope he finishes his term as governor, and instead the party looks in the direction of liberty and looks towards Rand Paul and Thomas Massey types instead, because I think that if they adopt that as the spirit of the party, really that's a message and a ticket that I think a lot of people can rally behind, especially if Rand Paul does really well with the investigations into Fauci over the next 2 years. But a lot can happen. A lot of this is speculation. I think a lot of people should question any real analysis that is happening and any um, attempt at saying this is what the voters were thinking, and not and not voting for a huge red wave. I mean, it is obvious that uh, that some places got redder and some places stayed blue. Um, and in hindsight, I think that probably is expected, especially since Roe v. Wade was a big issue on the ballot. Here in Montana, we're looking pretty dang good, but I think it was a mistake that LR 131, I believe is the name, was on the ballot. That was the uh, Born Alive abortion bill, and it was a resolution, and I think that actually brought out a lot of Democrats, and is probably why we didn't go as red as we would have liked to. Uh, but yeah, all of that's just kind of my thoughts on the last 2 days and the election. Um, but I just wanted to share my screen and show some of my Substack writings, since, like I said at the beginning, I'd like to start recording more or writing more. And I kind of want to give you guys a taste of what I've been doing. Since it was election day, I decided to write about Lysander Spooner and his perspective on voting. So on election day, I released a Substack. It's called Vote, It's Your Right. And then it has an asterisk and it says, but your only options are people who want nuclear war with Russia or nuclear war with China. Um, and then I kind of explain Lysander Spooner, give a little background about Lysander Spooner, and then I include an excerpt from Lysander Spooner's No Treason about his perspective on voting. So I just wanted to read that for you guys, and then I'll also attach this article in the description after we're done recording. And I see that there's someone listening right now. Can you type in the comments if the audio sounds all right? This isn't my typical recording environment, so just let me know if that's possible. All right, so it's not letting me share my screen, so I'm just going to read it instead. All right, so I just say what I'm reading today because I think that this is going to be a series that I'm going to do is just whatever I'm reading for the day, I'm going to write about if I don't have any other things to talk about. So, as a little introduction to No Treason, I say Lysander Spooner's No Treason, Natural Law, or The Science of Justice and Vices Are Not Crimes were immensely influential to me in high school. And I first discovered his works while researching John Locke and natural law for my honor civics class during my senior year. We were preparing for a We the People competition, the Center for Civic Education's We the People competition in Washington, D.C. And one of the topics that I was assigned in that class was on natural law and the philosophical basis for the Constitution and the principles that really this country was built on. And I'm very fortunate to have found Lysander Spooner and his works on natural law. And I continue, for those unfamiliar with his work, Lysander Spooner was a radical abolitionist lawyer who opposed the Fugitive Slave Act and made the case that slavery is prohibited by the Constitution under a textualist and originalist interpretation. He also argued that slavery was contradictory to natural law. Spooner's The Unconstitutionality of Slavery, written in 1845, was the most widely circulated abolitionist writing at the time and notably influenced Frederick Douglass, who abandoned William Lloyd Garrison's reading of the Constitution after reading Spooner. Frederick Douglass had adopted Garrison's view that the Constitution promoted slavery and actually protected slavery. And then after reading Spooner's The Unconstitutionality of Slavery, he actually then moved away from Garrison and adopted Spooner's interpretation, which is that slavery was unconstitutional. And then, like Douglass, Spooner was also associated with and potentially inspired John Brown of the C. John Harper's Ferry. There is some evidence that I think he actually wrote about it, that Spooner was attempting to kidnap a governor and hold him hostage until John Brown was released. So he also defended John Brown. And Spooner isn't as widely known today as he often gets overshadowed by abolitionists like Garrison in history classes. But I think a lot of today's originalist arguments can still be credited to him. And interestingly, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas also cited Lysander Spooner in his concurring opinion in the landmark Second Amendment case, McDonald v. Chicago, in 2010. And Thomas's main arguments were that the anti-slavery movement led to the 14th Amendment. And in making that case, he actually cites Lysander Spooner, who argued that slavery violated the natural right of all men to keep and bear arms for their personal defense. And then in my favorite work of Lysander Spooner's, which is No Treason, Spooner argues that insofar as the United States Constitution is contradictory with natural law, it's not legally binding on anyone because nobody can truly be understood to have consented to the document. So this actually came after the beginning of the Civil War, because Spooner was a defender of the Constitution, and then he became radicalized by the Civil War, and then argued that the Civil War was only justified if its purpose was to end slavery, because fundamentally Spooner did believe in natural law and justice. So insofar as the Civil War was to end slavery, its purpose was to end slavery. He was for it, but he argued that it was not justified if its purpose was to preserve the Union. And he argued that the Constitution is no contract, that it binds nobody and never did bind anybody, and that all those who pretend to act by its authority are really acting without any legitimate authority at all. So I just included a quote from later in No Treason in here. And then what originally interested me about No Treason in high school was what I considered its contribution to social contract theory and its denial of the consent of the governed. Um, Locke, in his second treatise of government, kind of justifies the modern state by arguing that the consent of the governed is necessary, and he then goes on to say that tacit consent is enough. So, like uh, simply voting or simply using public roads, for instance, uh, that is a form of tacitly agreeing to the system since you're participating in the system. That's kind of the argument. And I think No Treason really builds on this and criticizes this. And I don't understand Lysander Spooner and No Treason to be a rejection of the fundamental principle that government is justified by the consent of the governed. I think that really he takes John Locke to its and the second treatise of government to its logical conclusion, and he says that yes, the consent of the governed is necessary, but rather he denies that this consent actually exists today and actually occurs today, and he goes as far as denying any form of tacit consent as being um, legally binding. So I think fundamentally he still argues that the consent of the governed in a form of contract and consent is necessary for any legal arrangement, but he denies that simply voting is something that actually uh, signifies consent. So yeah, I'll attach the link to No Treason as well in the description after we're streaming. And I hope you read the entirety of it. There are also some audiobooks that I might be able to find and put in the description if you prefer that. And I really hope you appreciate the work as much as I do. Um, and since I wrote this on election day, I included an excerpt from No Treason on Voting. And it goes as follows. So he writes, of the 1/6 that are permitted to vote, probably not more than 2/3 or about 1/9 of the whole population have usually voted. And then I updated that for today's terms, and it says, so what I say is of the about 3/4 that are permitted to vote in the US today, not more than 2/3 or about 1/2 of the whole population have usually voted. And then Spooner continues, many never vote at all. Many vote only once in 2, 3, 5, or 10 years in periods of great excitement. And we see this with presidential elections. People often don't vote for their local candidates, or they don't vote in state elections, but people kind of rally in exciting presidential races. And Spooner continues, no one by voting can be said to pledge himself for any longer period than that for which he votes. If, for example, I vote for an officer who is to hold his office for only a year, I cannot be said to have thereby pledged myself to support the government beyond that term. Therefore, on the ground of actual voting, it probably cannot be said that more than 1/9 or 1/8 of the whole population are usually under any pledge to support the Constitution. Um, in recent years, since 1940, the number of voters in elections has usually fluctuated between 1/3 and 2/5 of the populace. It cannot be said that by voting, a man pledges himself to support the Constitution unless the act of voting be a perfectly voluntary one on his part. Yet the act of voting cannot be be called a voluntary one on the part of any large number of those who do vote. It is rather a measure of necessity imposed upon them by others than one of their own choice. On this point, I repeat what was said in a former number. I mean, yeah, and this just goes to the idea that like if you think about the amount of people who don't vote, like in the modern terms, that is about one half of the whole population does not vote in every election. So essentially, what Spooner is saying here is like the act of voting is not voluntary for these people. They're even opting out isn't a voluntary choice. You often hear that they choose to opt out. And therefore they choose and they consent to whatever everyone else is choosing. They kind of throw their hands in the air and they're willing to accept what others are voting for. And he denies this here. And Spooner continues, in truth, in the case of individuals, their actual voting is not to be taken as proof of consent, even for the time being. On the contrary, it is to be considered that without his consent having even been asked, a man finds himself environed by a government that he cannot resist, a government that forces him to pay money, render service, and forego the exercise of many of his natural rights under peril of weighty punishments. He sees, too, that other men practice this tyranny over him by the use of the ballot. He sees further that if he will but use the ballot himself, he has some chance of relieving himself from the tyranny of others by subjecting them to his own. In short, he finds himself without his consent, so situated that if he uses the ballot, he may become a master. If he does not use it, he must become a slave. And he has no other alternative than these two. In self-defense, he attempts the former. His case is analogous to that of a man who has been forced into battle, where he must either kill others or be killed himself. Because to save his own life in battle, a man takes the lives of his opponents. It is not to be inferred that the battle is one of his own choosing. Neither in contest with the ballot, which is a mere substitute for a bullet, because as his only chance of self-preservation, a man uses a ballot, is it to be inferred that the contest is one into which he voluntarily entered, that he voluntarily set up all his own natural rights as a stake against those of others, to be lost or won by the mere power of numbers. On the contrary, it is to be considered that in an exigency, I'm going to start that sentence over. On the contrary, it is to be considered that in an exigency into which he had been forced by others, and in which no other means of self-defense offered, he, as a matter of necessity, used the only one that was left to him. Doubtless the most miserable of men, under the most oppressive government in the world, if allowed the ballot, would use it, if they could see any chance of thereby ameliorating their condition. But it would not, therefore, be a legitimate inference that the government itself that crushes them was one which they had voluntarily set up or even consented to. Therefore, a man's voting under the Constitution of the United States is not to be taken as evidence that he ever freely assented to the Constitution, even for the time being. Consequently, we have no proof that any very large portion, even of the actual voters of the United States, ever really and voluntarily consented to the Constitution, even for the time being. Nor can we ever have such proof until every man is left perfectly free to consent or not, without thereby subjecting himself or his property to be disturbed or injured by others. As we can have no legal knowledge as to who votes from choice and who from the necessity thus forced upon him, we can have no legal knowledge as to any particular individual that he voted from choice, or consequently, that by voting he consented or pledged himself to support the government. Legally speaking, therefore, the act of voting utterly fails to pledge anyone to support the government. It utterly fails to prove that the government rests upon the voluntary support of anybody. On general principles of law and reason, it cannot be said that the government has any voluntary supporters at all, until it can be distinctly shown who its voluntary supporters are. As taxation is made compulsory on all, whether they vote or not, A large portion of those who vote, no doubt, do so to prevent their own money being used against themselves, when in fact they would have gladly abstained from voting if they could thereby have saved themselves from taxation alone, to say nothing of being saved from all the other usurpations and tyrannies of the government. To take a man's property without his consent and then to infer his consent because he attempts by voting to prevent that property from being used to his injury is a very insufficient proof of his consent to support the Constitution. It is, in fact, no proof at all. And as we can have no legal knowledge as to who the particular individuals are, if there are any, who are willing to be taxed for the sake of voting, we can have no legal knowledge that any particular individual consents to be taxed for the sake of voting, or consequently consents to support the Constitution. At nearly all elections, votes are given for various candidates for the same office. Those who vote for the unsuccessful candidates cannot properly be said to have voted to sustain the Constitution. They may, with more reason, be supposed to have voted not to support the Constitution, but specifically to prevent, or especially to prevent, the tyranny which they anticipate the successful candidate intends to practice upon them under color of the Constitution, and therefore may reasonably be supposed to have voted against the Constitution itself. This supposition is the more reasonable inasmuch as such voting is the only mode allowed to them of expressing their dissent to the Constitution. Many votes are usually given for candidates who have no prospect of success. Those who give such votes may reasonably be supposed to have voted as they did with a special intention not to support, but to obstruct the execution of the Constitution, and therefore against the Constitution itself. As all the different votes are given secretly, by secret ballot, there is no legal means of knowing from the votes themselves who votes for and who votes against the Constitution. Therefore, voting affords no legal evidence that any particular individual supports the Constitution. And where there can be no legal evidence that any particular individual supports the Constitution, it cannot legally be said that anybody supports it. It is clearly impossible to have any legal proof of the intentions of large numbers of men where there can be no legal proof of the intentions of any particular one of them. There being no legal proof of any man's intentions in voting, we can only conjecture them. As a conjecture, it is probable that a very large proportion of those who vote do so on this principle, that if, by voting, they could but get the government into their own hands or that of their friends and use its powers against their opponents, they would then willingly support the Constitution. But if their opponents are to have the power and use it against them, then they would not willingly support the Constitution. In short, men's voluntary support of the Constitution is doubtless, in most cases, wholly contingent upon the question whether, by means of the Constitution, they can make themselves masters or are to be made slaves. Such contingent consent as that is, in law and reason, no consent at all. As everybody who supports the Constitution by voting, if there are any such, does so secretly, by secret ballot, and in a way to avoid all personal responsibility for the acts of his agents or representatives, it cannot legally or reasonably be said that anybody at all supports the Constitution by voting. No man can reasonably or legally be said to do such a thing as assent to or support the Constitution unless he does it openly and in a way to make himself personally responsible for the acts of his agents, so long as they act within the limits of the power he delegates to them. As all voting is secret by secret ballot, and as all secret governments are necessarily only secret bands of robbers, tyrants, and murderers, the general fact that our government is practically carried on by means of such voting only proves that there is among us a secret band of robbers, tyrants, and murderers whose purpose is to rob, enslave, and so far as necessary to accomplish their purposes, murder the rest of the people. The simple fact of the existence of such a band does nothing towards proving that, quote, the people of the United States, unquote, or any of them, voluntarily supports the Constitution. For all the reasons that have now been given, voting furnishes no legal evidence as to who the particular individuals are, if there are any who voluntarily support the Constitution. It therefore furnishes no legal evidence that anybody supports it voluntarily. So far, therefore, as voting is concerned, the Constitution, legally speaking, has no supporters at all. And as a matter of fact, there is not the slightest probability that the Constitution has a single bona fide supporter in the country. That is to say, there is not the slightest probability that there is a single man in the country who both understands what the Constitution really is and sincerely supports it for what it really is. The ostensible supporters of the Constitution, like the ostensible supporters of most other governments, are made up of three classes. One, knaves, a numerous and active class who see in the government an instrument which they can use for their own aggrandizement or wealth. Two, dupes, a large class, no doubt, each of whom, because he is allowed one voice out of millions in deciding what he may do with his own person and his own property, because he is permitted to have the same voice in robbing, enslaving, and murdering others that others have in robbing, enslaving, and murdering himself, is stupid enough to imagine that he is a free man, a sovereign, that this is a free government, a government of equal rights, the best government on earth, and such like absurdities. Three, a class who have some appreciation of the evils of government, but either do not see how to get rid of them or do not choose to so far sacrifice their private interests as to give themselves seriously and earnestly to the work of making a change. So that's where the excerpt ends that I included in the Substack. And yeah, I mean, that was very insightful for me going through my honor civics class my senior year, which I've talked about in other podcasts. I brought on my civics teacher many times. He's now actually he's now a legislator in Montana. He was just elected as a legislator in Montana, and he introduced me to Tom Woods, who then introduced me. His podcast introduced me to Lysander Spooner, and then I dug deeper and I found his essays on natural law, which informed a lot of the work that I was doing in that class. And then luckily I found this, and it was very informative and kind of built upon the natural law theory that I was researching in Second Treatise of Government, Locke's Second Treatise of Government. And like I said before, I think that he brings Locke to his logical conclusion, because Locke, I mean, it's almost as if he's right all along with the homesteading principle, with building this, he's constructing this natural law theory, but then it's almost like he takes a step back when he's talking about consent of the government, and he says that tacit consent is sufficient. And I think Spooner recognized that it's not, and I think should really be seen as someone who corrects John Locke. I don't think he's arguing against John Locke as much as he is taking it to its logical conclusion. And then I'm going to try to share my screen again. I don't know why it wasn't letting me earlier. Let's see. Yeah, it's not going to let me. But I also, in this Substack, I included some tweets from the day, from election day, and I might continue to do this. I haven't since this post, but if people think it's a good idea, I might continue to do it. I included my tweet that actually got quite a bit of interactions. It got I think it's over 300 likes now. I just said it's also the title of this Substack, which is "Vote. It's your right!" exclamation point, and then it has an asterisk, and then below it says your only options are people who want nuclear war with Russia or people who want nuclear war with China. And then I also attached some memes that I think really complement what Spooner is saying here. There's also another tweet that is more serious and relevant to election day. Glenn Greenwald said he quote tweeted Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who said, "Many states don't allow mail-in ballots to be counted before election day, but many races can't be called until mail-ins are counted. which can take over 24 hours. This is normal, but some GOP are laying ground to claim any race not called tonight is suspicious. Don't fall for it. And Glenn Greenwald said, there's nothing normal about the world's richest country being unable to count votes for days or even weeks after Election Day. If you want to create such a system, don't be surprised when people see other countries counting all votes the same day and thus distrust this one. And then I attached another meme that said libertarianism, a noun, and it defines libertarianism. It says the radical notion that people are not property. Could get a little a little picky with that definition and say the radical notion that people are their own property, but it's good enough. And then I also attached it. It was actually Drew Kester. She tweeted a graphic from the Mises Caucus that is a quote of Michael Malice that says, people will say with a straight face that having one choice for dear leader is tyranny, but having two is freedom. And I think that only kind of gets to what Lysander Spooner is talking about here. And then also what I was trying to say in my tweet about, yeah, you do have a vote to write, but, or, whoa, a right to vote, but your only options are Tyrant 1 and Tyrant 2. And then I included another tweet that I actually tweeted a long time ago that says, imagine me, a kid in college who doesn't pay property taxes and has no kids in public school, receiving a ballot to vote on school boards and levies in my town so I can dilute the say of the parents who send their kids to school and those who pay property taxes. And this is actually a realization I had. I think my senior year of high school, I received a ballot for the first time. I had just become the age to vote, and we were voting for a levy, and the levy was for property taxes within the school district that I attended. But I actually lived outside of the school district, but was still within the district that I could vote for the levy. It was really weird. And then I was voting on whether people who own property should pay higher property taxes to pay for the school that I go to. And it just felt, even though it would benefit me, it would benefit my education. It just felt really weird that I would have any say over that, that it wouldn't be constrained just to the people who would have their property taxes increased. And I really saw that as an attempt to dilute the say. It's like almost a perversion of the idea that, we shouldn't have taxation without representation. It's like we have way too much representation in this case. It's taxation with too much representation. It's not even I should not have a say over these tax increases. And that was a realization really early on that I think informed my political beliefs today, and were kind of foundational. And one of the reasons I'm a libertarian. And then I also included a tweet from Dave Smith that says, just remember today that democracy is not on the ballot. The US is not a democracy. It's not a republic. It's a fascist oligarchy that allows for a minimal amount of participation from the citizens. However you feel about democracy, this ain't one. And I mean, that's the funny thing is, like, a lot of people get so angry at the idea that Democrats say that this is a democracy and that democracy is on the ballot. And the typical Republican response is, well, like, this isn't a democracy, this is a republic. But I wonder if deep down Republicans ask themselves, is the United States at all mirror the ideals that they want for this country? I think often what is conflated by Republicans, and what I used to do as a conservative, is that you kind of conflate what you want the U.S. to be with what it is. It certainly isn't what the founders intended. So maybe it ought to be a republic, but it certainly isn't today. And it's another kind of funny thing that I was talking about, is that, like, all the Democrats keep saying that democracy is on the ballot, but we really need to stop pretending that democracy is a good thing in the first place. Like, this used to be something that was taught in civics classes, and luckily I was taught this in mine because I had a really good teacher. But founders did not intend to have democracy. And if you've read Plato, if you've learned about the death of Socrates, you've learned why democracy is terrible. And democracy, as it's currently understood, is either mob rule, um, like it's taught by Plato, or it's a form of liberal hegemony. And I think both are terrible. Both are bad. Both should be rejected, and we should stop pretending they're good. But I will say, if we are to define democracy as the most representative of the people, where the people are sovereign, I think we can make a case as libertarians that, well, capitalism is the most democratic. But typically, that's not the definition that is used. Typically, what is being talked about is liberal hegemony and mob rule. And then I attached some more tweets here. The Libertarian Party New Hampshire on election day said, if we elect enough Republicans, maybe things can finally go back to the way they were in late 2020. Gets the point. And then I have a few more memes attached. But yeah, I hope everyone checks out that Substack. I hope people give me some feedback if I should continue doing things like this, and maybe I should continue recording podcasts like this where I cover what I wrote about in my Substacks. But I just wanted to read one more that I wrote yesterday. This is now, I believe, the fifth Substack that I've written. So definitely go subscribe, give me some feedback, share them if you like them. But yeah, so the podcast that I wrote yesterday, or the Substack that I wrote yesterday, I titled Spooner and the Science of Justice. And the subtitle is Lysander Spooner's Proto-Libertarian Natural Law. So yeah, after yesterday's post about Spooner and his perspective on voting, I said that I returned to Spooner's Natural Law, the Science of Justice. And thankfully, I discovered this essay while researching John Locke and natural law during my senior year of high school for my honor civics class. We were preparing for the Center for Civic Education's We the People national competitions in DC. And this was the essay that helped build much of the framework for the arguments that I made regarding natural law. Kind of the structure of the class was that we were assigned different units out of a textbook that we were assigned. And we had the option to pick which unit or which chapter out of the textbook we wanted to focus on and really emphasize. But I chose Unit 1 and Unit 4, which focused on the philosophical framework of the United States, and then the structure of the U.S. government. And so while we were preparing for these competitions, we were supposed to write 4-minute essays answering a question that we were assigned. So I was assigned, my group, my unit was assigned a question about natural law and classical republicanism. And in one of our presentations at the competition, I opened up with a quote from this essay by Lysander Spooner, which is also attached below in the excerpt or the passage that I attached below. But this quote says, "Natural law is the science which alone can tell us on what conditions mankind can live in peace." And I really like this quote because often the way that natural law is portrayed in law school or philosophy classes is it's almost like this mystical thing that is very arbitrary. And I think that Spooner grounds natural law and says, no, what it is it's the conditions for peace. We might have many cultural disagreements in the world, but natural law is the very basic legal framework that can maintain justice and peace. And I really appreciate that now, especially after, going 4 years through an undergrad program, through a very liberal philosophy program at the University of Montana, and hearing many arguments against natural law. And I also took, as an undergrad, I was able to take a real law class at the law school. I got accepted to. I knew the professor, so they allowed me. I got an overwrite, and it allowed me to take the class at the law school with law students. And I mean, the whole thing essentially was a rejection of natural law, and it kind of, um, the weird binary was like, we either have like grounded positive law here, where law is whatever it says it is, law is whatever the law on the books are, and then their uh, you know caricature of what natural law is, which is like this weird mystical thing that only religious people believe. But Spooner, he was an atheist. At least I think he was an atheist. He definitely wasn't a Christian. I might be thinking of Thomas Paine, but Thomas Paine was definitely an atheist, anti-theist. But I believe Spooner was an atheist. If he may have been a deist, but I definitely know he wasn't a Christian. So the idea that he had kind of this grounded natural law, I think, is a complement to libertarian natural law, and I think it very much coheres with Murray Rothbard's non-aggression axiom, um, as I think you'll find below. So in the article in this passage that I've attached. So I'll just read this small little passage. It's much shorter than the other one. Um, but yeah, so the first few paragraphs of Natural Law, the Science of Justice, it was written in 1882, are as follows. The science of mine and thine, the science of justice, is the science of all human rights, of all a man's rights of person and property, of all his rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is the science which alone can tell any man what he can and cannot do, what he can and cannot have, what he can and cannot say without infringing the rights of any other person. It is the science of peace, and the only science of peace, since it is the science which alone can tell us on what conditions mankind can live in peace or ought to live in peace with each other. These conditions are simply these. First, that each man shall do towards each other all that justice requires him to do, as, for example, that he shall pay his debts, that he shall return borrowed or stolen property to its owner, and that he shall make reparation for any injury he may have done to the person or property of another. The second condition is that each man shall abstain from doing to another anything which justice forbids him to do, as, for example, that he shall abstain from committing theft, robbery, arson, murder, or any other crime against the person or property of another. So long as these conditions are fulfilled, men are at peace and ought to remain at peace with each other. But when either of these conditions is violated, men are at war, and they must necessarily remain at war until justice is reestablished. Through all time, so far as history informs us, wherever mankind have attempted to live in peace with each other, both the natural instincts and the collective wisdom of the human race have acknowledged and prescribed as an indispensable condition obedience to this one only universal obligation, that each should live honestly towards every other. The ancient maxim makes the sum of a man's legal duty to his fellow men to be simply this: to live honestly, to hurt no one, to give everyone his due. This entire maxim is really expressed in the single words, to live honestly, since to live honestly is to hurt no one and give to everyone his due. So yeah, that's the first part of natural law, or the science of justice, and I think it's pretty beautiful. And I think it really, like I said, it really complements libertarianism, and it coheres with it. I think it is proto-libertarian, and I mean, very consistent with what today's libertarians consider the non-aggression principle, which is the fundamental axiom of libertarianism. So, back in when was this written again? It was 1882. We had a proto-libertarian, and I talked a little bit about his history and his history as an abolitionist and how prominent he was at the time. But he was also a lawyer. He also was a competitor to he started a competitor to the post office, and which was illegal, and the federal government tried to shut him down. He also practiced law illegally. He wasn't a legal lawyer, but he was still, he was still practicing law. And I think that he was a practicing libertarian too. The libertarian idea, I think, of law school, and it would reject law school and the current way that we have lawyers in the United States. You have to have like an accredited university that you go to before you can go to a law school, and then you have to go through law school before you can take the bar exam, and then the bar exam then makes you a lawyer. But Lysander Spooner didn't do any of that, and I actually really hope that Montana gets rid of those requirements. I know California doesn't have those requirements, and that's why Kim Kardashian is now practicing in California. But I think that that's the way that it should be. I think we should have competition, and we shouldn't have state imposed accreditation rules. We should have competition of legal ideas, because after going through the undergrad program at the University of Montana and seeing how liberal it is, wouldn't it be great if we had other institutions, other universities that could compete with the state universities that have kind of more libertarian and Spooner's perspective of law. So yeah, those are kind of my thoughts on Spooner. I wanted to return to him because I haven't read him in a long time. I also haven't been writing as much, as I said at the beginning of this podcast. And all of that was inspired by my podcast with Dan Sanchez and his recent endeavor to write every single day. And I'm really looking up to him in his attempt at doing that. And he's continued to write and put something out every single day. So starting with my podcast with him last Wednesday, I hope to continue to release a Substack either on the podcast and the content that was discussed in the podcast, and maybe I'll take like segments out of each podcast that I find interesting and highlight those so I can retain this stuff better. Or maybe I'll do stuff like this and continue to lean into the writings that influenced me early on. So yeah, definitely give me feedback. Let me know what you think. Comment below. Also check out my interview with Dan that I'll link in the description. Subscribe to my Substack, share them around if you like them, and give me feedback. Subscribe to me on YouTube, Odyssey, Apple Podcasts, and all the other podcatchers. I'll link to those below, and then I'll also have my link tree in the description too. Thanks so much for listening, and hopefully I'll be back next week with an interview since I rescheduled. But thanks, and make sure to subscribe.